In this video, I will give you an introduction to setting up clustering in the Curity identity server. I will also show you how to define an OAuth client, and I'll give you some more tools that you can use to learn about the various OAuth flows. Here I am working with the Curity admin UI, which I set up in a previous video, which you can watch on our YouTube channel. I have loaded here the default configuration, which you can download from the customer portal. And in this, I want to add a new OAuth client, so I'll click on my profile called OAuth, and under Applications, I can create a new client, and the name of this client is going to be called Python app. This will correspond to the client ID that the Python application will use in the different OAuth requests. I will allow this application to only use one of my scopes that I have defined in the profile, and that will be OpenID. And it will only be able to do the code flow. So even though I have other capabilities set up in this profile, the client will not be able to use those. I will also set a secret since the code flow requires a secret. And I will set a redirect URI, and this will correspond to the one where the Python application is listening, and the endpoint that will handle the callback and convert that access code to a token. So now I have my Python OAuth client created, and now I'll set up another node. The one I have here is my admin node, and that was created during installation, but I'll go ahead and add another one, and I'll call that one internal. And because the Python application has a hard time working with HTTPS, what I can even do is just go ahead and put that on HTTP. And I'll put it on 7070, and now the endpoints that should be available are all of the authenticated OAuth endpoints. So now you're seeing how the different endpoints associated with a profile can be assigned to one node or another. So now I create this node. If you wanted, you could even remove the endpoints from your other node, but I won't do that just now. So I'll go ahead and commit that. Now it's committed. And now we have a new OAuth client and we have a new node, but the only node that is running, as you see here, is admin. So let's go ahead and start the second node that I created. And I can do that by saying bin, here I am in the ID server home directory. I can say ID server, I can say no admin, and the service ID is internal. So this will start the second node, and that will receive its configuration from the configuration service, and the endpoints then that it's supposed to host will become active, and the port will become open, so it will start listening on 7070. So now that we have started that node, let's go ahead and get some client to work with. So if you go to github.com/curityo, you'll find a bunch of repositories, and one of those is a Python application that does the OpenID Connect flow. So let's go ahead and clone that. And then the other one that we want is an API. So we want to be able to call an API and with our access tokens. So that you'll find another repository called OAuth filter for Python Flask. Let's go ahead and clone that one as well. And now let's do a little bit of editing of the example one. So there's some settings in here that we need to change to point out the configuration that we have. So I'll just go ahead and configure the token endpoint, introspection, the anonymous, and the revoke endpoint to be on our internal node, and the others to be on our external node. So that should work. So now let's try to run that. So just Python and then app. There we go. So now it's up and working. So now in our browser we can go to HTTPS localhost 5443. Now this brings up an application which will do the OpenID Connect flow. So we can go ahead and do that by clicking the sign in button. And here I can create an account. My password manager filled that in for me, but I don't have an account, so I can click on that button and go ahead and create one. So now my account is created and I can log in. And now the OAuth client got, or the Python OAuth client got the access code, and it redeemed that access code on the back channel to the internal server, that token endpoint that we have hosted there, providing the client ID and the secret that we created, and got itself back an ID token, which I have printed here. And from that, then it obtained the name of the user. So in the subject claim, it found out that the user was called John Doe, which is what we created in the form. And it also got back an access token and a refresh token. So now we can't yet call the API because we didn't start that. So let's actually go ahead and do that. And then I'll show you a little bit more on what we can do with the Python test application. So that was in here. So what we need to do here is we need to create some sort of Flask application that will provide the API. So we'll just go ahead and type this. It's just a little bit. So we need to import from Flask some attribute called Flask ng, and then from the OAuth filter, there is a attribute called OAuth filter. And now we create a Flask application by just using that Flask constructor, and we'll pass it the name of the Python file. And now we need to create the filter itself. So we'll go ahead and new up one of these filters, saying verify SSL equals false. Real secure, I know, but that's not the point. The point is just to learn about how all this works to start with, and then we can make it hyper secure. So we'll go ahead and expose an API called Hello World, and we will require, using that OAuth filter, that it be protected by some set of scopes, and in our case OpenID Connect is going to be enough, and we'll call our handler Hello World, and that should just return some JSON, JSON dump string, and then some dictionary hello, and then the user. So hello equals G user. Good. Now let's go ahead and configure how the filter should work. So configure it with opaque. So instead of using a jot, we'll go ahead and use a opaque token. And in order to do that, we need to dereference it using the introspection endpoint. So where is that? That's on our internal server, which is on port 7070. And the URI is called introspection. And the credentials now for this API are gateway client and secret. I don't think it's set to secret right now, but we can reset it here in a sec. So now we're going to run this application listening on any interface, and we're going to put his port on 5555. Okay, so let's just go ahead and reset his password real quick. You can find that here. Gateway client, and the secret, that's the hash. I can't remember what the hash was, so we'll set it to something else and commit that. Okay, so now this should work if I typed everything right. So let's go ahead and start the API. Cannot import Flask. This should be a capital F. And app is not defined. Oh, of course. You start with underscores. So now our API is running. So now we have an access code in our OpenID Connect client, and we can actually call it. So even though we got it a while ago, it might still work. So let's go ahead and try to call our API. Yeah, it works. So we introspected that, and remember in the Flask client we did the return g.user in that dictionary. That's what's printed there. So you can see that this g.user is being obtained from that filter. So as we call the API with the GUID access token here, in the introspection endpoint is called on our internal node and converted into some JSON, which the Flask filter then converts into some attributes that the Flask application can use and return as JSON to show us the API response here. So if we were too slow, or we could refresh the token using the refresh grant type by calling into the token endpoint. So if you see now our access token changed, and if we call the API, we get the same results. So even though the token has changed, the user that represents that delegation that the token embodies is still the same, and the user doesn't have to log in. So we can refresh and extend their session within this Python application, even if our access token expires. And we can simply log out and start the flow again. So in this very, very fast demo, I hope that you learned some things about how to set up clustering in the Curity Identity Server, and some tools that you can use to learn more about these flows, together with Postman and the other things that you'll find on our GitHub repository. It could hopefully help you to get going relatively quickly, but if you do have questions, please feel free to leave a comment here on YouTube, or to drop us a line at info@curity.io. Thanks.